Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal when Curtis first began to question the legitimacy of Drew's recent legal triumph. It wasn't born out of petty rivalry or personal resentment. It was instinct, a gut-deep, visceral realization that something about Drew's ascent to legal and social dominance was disturbingly unclean. The more Curtis examined the timeline, the testimonies, the strangely coordinated silences of key figures, the more he became convinced that Drew had manipulated the system in ways no one dared to challenge. But Curtis wasn't just anyone. He knew that if there was one person who could shatter the illusion Drew had so meticulously crafted, it was Jacinda. She had once been close to Drew, too close. She had witnessed, without ambiguity or coercion, Drew voluntarily take ketamine during a private, off-the-record conversation meant to soothe his mental breakdown. If she could be brought back to Port Charles and testify, everything would change. Not just the custody battle with Willow, but Drew's credibility, his alliances, his influence over the entire judicial and social infrastructure of Port Charles would begin to crumble. Curtis acted swiftly. He contacted Felicia, knowing that her investigative instincts, honed from years of police work and private surveillance, would be crucial. Together, they arranged for Jacinda's safe return. Flights were booked under aliases. A private apartment in Chicago, unlisted, shielded from prying eyes, was prepared as her temporary haven. Every precaution was taken. Yet, when the day of her arrival came, Jacinda didn't board the plane. She didn't call, didn't cancel, didn't even leave a message. She simply vanished. Alarmed, Felicia traveled to the apartment. What awaited her wasn't the aftermath of a woman who had fled in fear, but the eerie precision of a professional cover-up. The place was sterile, vacant. No clothes, no toiletries, no notes. Even the coffee in the cupboard was gone. It was as if Jacinda had never existed. Felicia, who had seen many scenes of panic, of escape, of chaos, immediately recognized the difference. This wasn't a retreat. It was a surgical removal. Someone had cleaned up. Someone with resources, timing, and a motive. Someone like Drew. Curtis knew in that moment that he had underestimated the enemy. While he had been quietly building a legal counteroffensive, Drew had been eliminating threats. Jacinda's disappearance wasn't an act of cowardice or betrayal, it was an abduction. Drew had silenced her before she could speak. There were no security camera logs, no witnesses, no digital trails. Just a haunting void that screamed of premeditation. Yet when Curtis tried to raise alarm, he was met with skepticism. Drew was untouchable in the eyes of many. With his carefully curated public image as a devoted father, a recovering veteran, and a philanthropic business leader, no one could imagine him capable of orchestrating something so vile. Curtis, on the other hand, bore the baggage of past failures and impulsive decisions. He appeared desperate, even paranoid. But Felicia was not deterred. Driven by instinct and an unshakable belief in the truth, she dug deeper. Using her connections in law enforcement and her skill with satellite data analysis, she began following the breadcrumbs Drew hadn't managed to erase. A series of unregistered pings from a disposable satellite phone. A gap in GPS signals near upstate New York. Minor discrepancies that wouldn't raise alarms alone, but together, they formed a map. A path that led to a dilapidated farmhouse near Ithaca, miles from any major roads or cell towers. Inside, Felicia found what she feared and hoped for, a bolted room, heavily insulated and soundproofed. And within it, Jacinda. She was disoriented, dehydrated, terrified, but alive. Her eyes, once dulled by sedation and confinement, lit with cautious recognition when she saw Felicia. It didn't take much convincing. Jacinda wanted out. She wanted justice. She wanted Drew to pay. Under police protection, she was brought back to Port Charles. As doctors assessed her condition, attorneys were summoned, and within days, Jacinda was scheduled to appear at a closed-door hearing that would change everything. The moment Jacinda stepped into the courtroom, the air shifted. Her testimony was damning. She recounted the day Drew took ketamine, calmly, casually, admitting he needed a break from the pressure of being everything to everyone. She detailed how he laughed it off, assured her it was controlled, that no one would ever know. She described his demeanor, not someone coerced or manipulated, but a man fully aware of what he was doing. The revelation devastated Drew's legal team. His previous statements about being drugged or framed were now in tatters. More importantly, the entire foundation of his custody argument against Willow began to crack. And then came the part no one expected, Jacinda's account of the abduction. She described waking up with a sharp chemical taste in her mouth, being dragged through a service exit, waking again in a room she couldn't escape. No windows, no clocks, no contact. Only silence and the unmistakable scent of Drew's cologne the night he visited her, to make sure she wouldn't change her mind. The courtroom gasped. The judge demanded recess. Reporters camped outside like vultures sensing blood. Drew, once composed and eloquent, now stared blankly, his lips pressed into a thin, colorless line. Willow, who had been seated in silent support behind Drew, slowly stood and walked out without a word. The woman who once clung to Drew as her rock, who defended him against Carly, Michael, and even Jason, now felt nothing but betrayal. She didn't need to confront him, his actions had spoken louder than any justification he could offer. The image of the man she thought she knew. Compassionate, heroic, noble, had shattered into something cold, calculating, and deeply dangerous. From that day forward, Drew found himself abandoned by those he once counted as allies. Curtis, once ridiculed for paranoia, now stood vindicated. Felicia, once retired from active investigations, was hailed as a hero. Jacinda, though traumatized, found purpose in helping prosecute the man who once charmed her into silence. And Willow, whose heart had been torn between the man she loved and the child she barely understood, finally chose truth over illusion. Drew remained in Port Charles, under a cloud of suspicion, the subject of a criminal inquiry and public scorn. The mask had fallen. The lies exposed. And the one thing he thought he had mastered, control, was no longer his to wield. In the quiet that followed, the people of Port Charles were reminded once again that in their town, nothing stays buried forever. Not even the darkest secrets. Drew had always fashioned himself as the architect of outcomes, the man behind the curtain pulling the strings while others danced unknowingly to the rhythm he composed. Control wasn't just a tactic, it was his entire identity. He built his public persona on precision, calculated charm, and a seemingly unshakable confidence. To the world, he was a war hero turned executive, a man who had rebuilt his life through determination and integrity. But behind closed doors, Drew operated differently. He anticipated threats before they emerged, neutralized opposition before it gained momentum, and manipulated emotional alliances like a chess master plotting 6 moves ahead. For a long time, it worked. He convinced everyone, Willow, the courts, even himself, that his path was righteous, that his decisions were born out of necessity rather than malice. But now, standing at the epicenter of a storm he could no longer contain, Drew began to feel the crushing weight of unraveling power. The courtroom revelations had detonated like explosives beneath the foundation of everything he'd built. Jacinda's testimony wasn't just damning, it was irrefutable. The moment she described the locked room, the sedatives, the encounter with him during her captivity, the public perception of Drew shifted from flawed hero to calculated criminal. Overnight, his image as a loving father and principled leader was replaced with headlines branding him a kidnapper, a liar, a man willing to destroy a woman's life to preserve a narrative he had carefully sculpted for the courts. His legal team scrambled to contain the fallout, filing injunctions and challenging admissibility, but the damage was already done. The court of public opinion had issued its verdict. The people of Port Charles no longer saw Drew as the victim. He had become the villain. Behind the scenes, Drew raged. When news reached him that it was Felicia who had tracked down Jacinda and exposed his secret, he erupted in a fury that stunned even his closest aides. He shattered glasses, overturned a table, and screamed at his staff for failing to intercept the leak. But underneath the anger was panic, a rising tide of dread he could not suppress. Felicia had moved swiftly, with surgical precision, and in doing so, she had destroyed any plausible deniability he might have had. Jacinda's survival was one thing, her testimony, her willingness to speak the truth without hesitation, had closed every possible escape route he had prepared. No more silence. No more diversion. No more smearing Curtis as an unstable conspiracist. That narrative had evaporated the moment Jacinda walked into the courthouse flanked by police officers and declared, in perfect clarity, that Drew had imprisoned her. He tried to regain control, reaching out to Willow with half-truths and emotional appeals, but she no longer responded. Her silence was louder than any accusation. She had seen the truth with her own eyes, heard Jacinda's voice tremble under oath, watched as Drew's calm demeanor crumbled into defensive hostility. Willow, who once defended him against Carly, Michael, and even her own doubts, had retreated behind an emotional wall. She no longer asked him questions. She no longer touched his hand. She no longer called him safe. And in that absence, Drew felt something he hadn't felt in years: irrelevance. His future in politics, once bolstered by community support and donor confidence, now teetered on the edge of collapse. Endorsements were withdrawn. His campaign team disbanded quietly. Behind closed doors, former allies deleted his number. Television anchors who once praised his speeches now dissected his psychological profile with clinical detachment. Words like sociopath and narcissistic tendencies began appearing in public discourse. His world, once orderly and responsive to his every command, now moved without him, and he couldn't stop it. And yet, the most haunting blow didn't come from the media, the courts, or even Jacinda. It came in the quiet of his home, in the early hours before sunrise, when the noise died down and all that remained was reflection. He stood in front of the mirror in his private study, staring into the eyes of a man he no longer recognized. His skin looked pale, waxy under the sterile overhead light. His jaw, once clenched with conviction, now trembled with fatigue. He had rehearsed every possible outcome: victory, delay, settlement, but not this. Not the absolute collapse of control. And as he met his own gaze, he saw what everyone else now saw: not the mastermind, not the victim of a smear campaign, but a broken man, unraveling from the inside out. A manipulator exposed. A lover abandoned. A father defeated. A man so desperate to preserve power that he'd violated every line he once claimed to stand for. For the first time in his adult life, Drew didn't see a strategist in the mirror. He saw a failure. Not just a legal defeat, but a moral one. He had lost the trust of the one woman who stood by him, the credibility that once made him invincible, and the legacy he tried so hard to shape. And unlike the countless situations he had previously orchestrated, there was no plan B. No redemption arc he could manufacture. No pawn he could move into place. The walls were closing in, and the man who once controlled the board now found himself checkmated, not by an enemy, but by the consequences of his own ambition. At that very moment, while the media spiraled into frenzy and whispers of Drew's downfall echoed through every corridor of Port Charles, Curtis stood silent amid the aftermath, not as a man basking in victory, but as a soldier bracing for what he knew would be the beginning of a much larger, far more treacherous war. There was no sense of triumph coursing through his veins. No celebratory call. No smug declaration of, "I told you so." Because Curtis understood what most others didn't. This was not the end. This was merely the curtain rising on a darker act of a play where truth, loyalty, and justice no longer operated as moral constants, but as volatile instruments bent, warped, and twisted at will by those who held unchecked power. What had been exposed was not just Drew's malevolence, it was the system's willingness to entertain it until it became too inconvenient to ignore. Curtis had spent too much time watching good people lose everything while powerful ones rewrote rules mid-game. So even with Jacinda safe and Drew's empire collapsing in real time, Curtis remained wary. There were still factions who benefited from Drew's rise, people who had quietly propped up his narrative because it served their own agendas. There would be retaliation, shadow campaigns, whispered threats dressed as olive branches. He could already sense the unease in the eyes of judges who once praised Drew's character, the discomfort of former allies realizing the storm clouds they helped summon had now turned against them. Curtis knew his name had been etched into a list of targets. His refusal to stay silent, his persistence in seeking the truth, had earned him enemies too powerful to name aloud. But it didn't matter. Because for the first time in a long time, Curtis felt something stronger than fear, clarity. He didn't thank Felicia with words, because he didn't need to. Their bond, forged in quiet defiance, spoke in glances and shared burdens. She had done what few dared, stepped into the darkness without a badge or mandate, armed only with instinct and grit, and pulled the truth back into the light. She had faced the possibility of failure, even death, but never hesitated. And now, even as her actions placed her in the crosshairs of those who would rather Jacinda have stayed vanished, Felicia stood tall, unapologetic, unshaken, and profoundly vital to the turning tide. Jacinda, recovering in a secure location under police protection, had faced her own reckoning. The trauma of her abduction clung to her skin like invisible scars. But pain had not robbed her of strength. When questioned about her willingness to continue testifying, she didn't flinch. She didn't stammer. Her answer was simple: I will not be silenced. She knew there were still loyalists, remnants of Drew's inner circle, who viewed her as a threat to be neutralized. But she no longer cared. Her silence had once enabled a monster. Her voice, now, would hold him accountable. No matter the cost. Meanwhile, Willow wandered through the ruins of her former life, devastated by the realization that she had been complicit, willingly or not, in a narrative built on coercion and cruelty. Her love for Drew, once blinding and unwavering, now lay in fragments too sharp to touch. She had defended him, protected him, and turned a blind eye to the whispers of doubt that others tried to share. And in doing so, she had endangered not just herself, but Daisy, the child who should have been shielded from such chaos, not used as leverage in a war waged with deceit. The guilt ate at her, hollowing her out from within. She didn't try to defend herself publicly. She didn't offer explanations. Instead, she withdrew from the noise, from the headlines, from the polarized opinions swirling around her name. She chose solitude, not as an escape, but as an act of penance. She began to write letters, unsent, unspoken confessions, addressed to Daisy, the child whose laughter had once reminded her what innocence looked like. She hoped that one day, perhaps years from now, when the world had moved on, Daisy might understand that not all mistakes were born from malice. Some were simply born from misplaced trust. And while that did not absolve Willow, it pushed her to live differently, to rebuild a self that could one day deserve forgiveness. And so, as the dust settled and Drew's carefully curated empire collapsed under the weight of truth, General Hospital once again proved itself to be the theater where no secret, no matter how deeply buried, could remain hidden forever. Beneath its fluorescent lights and sterile hallways, betrayals were unearthed, alliances were tested, and justice, however slow and brutal, always found a way to surface. The manipulator who once controlled every move, who once silenced witnesses and bent hearts to his will, now found himself betrayed not by his enemies, but by the very pawns he had once thought disposable. Jacinda. Willow. Even Curtis. Each of them had once played a role in his ascension. Now, they were the architects of his fall. And as the final pieces of his game were scattered across a board he no longer owned, Drew was left to confront the bitter truth of his undoing. That power achieved through manipulation is fragile, and when stripped away, what remains is not a man of influence, but a man profoundly and irrevocably alone. In the end, what unraveled in the heart of Port Charles was not merely the downfall of a single man, but the unraveling of a myth. One meticulously built on charm, secrecy, and control. Drew, once heralded as a symbol of resilience and reform, now stood as a cautionary tale of ambition unchecked and truth suppressed. His fall was not orchestrated by some grand rival, but by the courage of those he underestimated: Curtis, who refused to look away; Felicia, who pursued the shadows until they surrendered their secrets; Jacinda, who chose truth over safety; and Willow, who, despite being shattered by betrayal, found the strength to begin again. Yet this reckoning was never about revenge. It was about accountability in a world where justice is too often delayed, distorted, or denied. And while Drew's empire collapsed beneath the weight of its lies, what rose in its place was not triumph, but resolve. A community that had seen too much deception chose to remember what it means to resist. To speak. To protect the vulnerable. Even when the cost is steep. As the corridors of General Hospital continued to echo with whispers of the past and murmurs of redemption, one truth stood immovable: no matter how deep the lie, no matter how carefully crafted the illusion, there will always come a time when the truth demands to be heard. And in that moment, no amount of power, no manipulation, no legacy can withstand it. Drew had played every angle, controlled every board. But in the final reckoning, it was integrity, courage, and memory that made the last move. And so, the pieces reset. Not to forget, but to begin again, with eyes wide open.